All right, hello and welcome to yet another Value Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Walker, and with me today, I'm happy to have on for the second time, Chris McIntyre. Chris is the founder of the McIntyre Partnerships. Chris, how's it going?
Good, it's good. Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, hey, let me start this podcast the way I do every podcast. First, with a disclaimer, everyone should remember nothing on here is investing advice. Everyone should do their own due diligence, consult their own financial advisors. And then second, with a pitch for you, my guest, people can go listen to our first podcast for the full pitch, but you're exactly the type of guest I have. You run a concentrated book, you do deep work on all the stuff you buy, and sometimes, rarely, we even get you to put up a website on the stuff that you buy, which I know is about to happen for the stock we're going to talk about today. So that all out the way, let's talk about the company today. The ticker is MSGE, Madison Square Garden Entertainment. I believe the website, it might be up when this podcast comes out or maybe a day later, but it'll be MSGE is cheapstock.com.
Yep.
So I'll flip it over to you. What is MSGE and why is it a cheap stock?
Sure. And do you want me to just go straight into the thesis, or do you want? Because I know you had a podcast before, so I wanted to make sure I'm hitting on.
Why don't you give a general overview just so people know the assets we're talking about? Because the story's changed a little bit and people just might not know it. The last episode was 40 episodes ago. He's referring to. I did a podcast with John Boyer on MSGN and MSG, which merged now are just MSG. But go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So MSGE is a let's skip right to where it's at now, not give the whole history because there's plenty of that written online. So MSGE is a holdco. It's basically the Dolan family's entertainment assets that are not the Knicks and the Rangers, which is ticker MSGS.
Yep.
So MSGE is basically 4 different business lines structured as a holding company. So and the reason I highlight that is some of the debt is bankruptcy remote and some of the assets are owned on an unlevered basis. And so simply looking at the balance sheet will not tell the whole story of what you're actually buying when you're purchasing a share of MSGE. I lump it into 4 different buckets. There is the Madison Square Garden Arena. There is an entertainment asset business, which is mainly depending upon how you want to actually think about it, it's the shows that are not it's reported as the entertainment segment. So sorry, I'm stuttering over it, but it's to simplify right now so I don't spin out of control. It is the other entertainment assets that they have, like the Rockettes,
yep.
The Beacon Theater, the Chicago Theater, I believe. And then the third business bucket, I would call and I also in that bucket, I also would include sort of like the Tao and the other thing, which are actually reported separately as segments, but conceptually, I think you should think about them as like the entertainment, dining, club, yep. Sort of live assets that are not Madison Square Garden.
These are the assets that have been closed for the past 18 months.
Yeah, these are your not good COVID plays. And then the third basket would be the Sphere, which is probably the most debated and sort of hot topic kind of item in the story, which is a large new construction in Las Vegas, located on the Strip. They're taking roughly $1.9 billion, rounded up to 2, whatever. On a new, should be state-of-the-art, iconic, hopefully, asset in Vegas that is a large concert venue, basically, that will have state-of-the-art sound and all this other stuff, which we'll get into. And then they also own the regional sports networks, MSG networks, for the Knicks and Rangers. They also have a hockey package that has the Islanders and Devils and stuff. And so that is very much a different business than the rest of it, even though they're all kind of connected to being live entertainment asset, New York sports, things. And so they own that, which is somewhat connected to the fact that they own the Knicks and Rangers. And so we'll talk about that asset after this. That's basically what you own. You own the Garden Arena. You own a live entertainment business outside of the arena, specifically and heavily weighted towards Tao and Lavo and these sort of clubby restaurants that are in New York and Vegas and other places. You own the Sphere, and then you own our regional sports network.
Perfect. So there are puts and takes to all of those different assets, right? But I'm going to start with the most obvious question. I think the question, I come to this company with a lot of history. Anyone in New York, I know you live in New York too. Anyone in New York comes to anything the Dolans control with a lot of history and angst, right? But I think the most obvious question would be, right now, the enterprise value of MSGE is $2.8 billion as you and I are speaking, right? I don't think there's any person in the world who would look at all of the assets that the company owns and say, that the sum total of them is not worth more than $2.8 billion, right? The Madison Square Garden itself, which they own, $2.8 billion is pushing it, but it's a big majority of that thing, right? So I think this would fall into the bucket of what I think of as companies that are always undervalued. It's clear that their assets are worth more, but when people look at them, people say they're run by bad managers who are going to light money on fire, So we'll dive into some more of the lighting money on fire and everything going forward. But as just a first take, what would your response to my pushback, that bear pushback, be?
It's funny. Just pause here for a second. Is it what will be on the website and my slide that I've been pitching it on? As I lay out the thesis and all that stuff, and before I get into the details, I actually pause and I'm like, okay, the Dolans are not as bad as you think they are.
I said this. So MSG, before it spun everything off, was one of my largest positions for a long time. And I would always say the Dolans are not as bad as you think they are. And then the Sphere and some of the other stuff they've done recently has kind of got me on the Dolans are as bad as you think they are trained. But go ahead.
So the way I would counter it is we could talk about what the Dolans have specifically done here, but I think an underappreciated, if you follow like the Twitter sphere and like, certain write-ups on Value Investors Club, all that kind of stuff. I think an underappreciated detail of the story is like they're building the Sphere, right? And so this business is massively cash flow negative. It has $1.3 billion of cash on the balance sheet, so that's not an issue, right? But like, they're burning cash right now. But like once the Sphere is done, underneath this are like real cash flow positive businesses. And the Dolans have bought back stock. They bought back tons of stock at MSGN, right? We can talk about whether that was a good idea or bad idea, right? At current prices, it looks bad. Doesn't mean it was probabilistically a bad decision to make in the past, right? But like, I think it's an underappreciated detail of the story. Is like, once this is done, this business is going to throw off cash and the Dolans buy back stock. And so like, we can talk about how to value it. We can talk about what the real multiple is. We can talk about portfolio discounts. I'd argue if the Sphere is a success, everyone will be talking about how great the Dolans are and how like it takes a rare mind to take a multi-year contract. You know what I mean? Like, sorry.
Just to back your point up, there are two recent investments that the Dolans made. One was buying the Forum out in Los Angeles and revamping that. And two was actually in 2010, they did a big, I can't remember exactly how much they spent on, but it was well into the 9 figures, if I remember correctly, remodel of the garden itself. And in both cases, analysts were saying, you guys are destroying so much value. These are the dumbest things we've ever seen. And with the Forum, they made multiples of their money on that investment. And with the garden, the return on investment, they say, I think it's like 15% unlevered or something. I don't know. But everyone at this point acknowledges it was a great use of money. So, when Sphere first started up, I was like, you can doubt them at your own peril because their history of buying, renovating, building stadiums is actually really good. But now I kind of fall into a different camp. To your point on valuation, they put their projections in the proxy, right? 2025 MSGN plus MSG. They say the whole company will do $435 million in after-tax cash flow. This is under a $3 billion enterprise value. Like that would be worth a lot of money.
Yeah. And the company is basically, there's the term loan on, and it's like also when you think about that cash flow, like the company is very conservative leverage. There's a term loan that's on the MSGN piece that they bought because they basically just bought the stock of MSGN for 10 million shares, roughly speaking.
Yep. And
so that term loan is basically done, hasn't changed at all, right? But like if you think about it, like depending on what you think of cash flow generation in the next year or two, but like if you think construction costs come in roughly where they model them, right? And then you kind of just model out, you're basically saying at the end of 2023, like X the term loan that is only on the MSGN piece, this is an unlevered asset that's going to be yielding, I would think that probably it says it's like 110 to 120 million or whatever of like the cash flow coming from the end piece. So you're talking about like 300 million of like unlevered cash flow on like at that price, depending on what you want to value the end piece, like it's quite cheap. And like, these are frankly like very leverageable assets, I would say.
Yeah. Something like outside of COVID, something like Madison Square Garden, it's always going to be sold out. It should be a very infrastructure-like asset, right? So let's dive into the different pieces here.
Yeah.
I think the first and the most controversial piece, MSGN, it might be approaching there because the deal was kind of shady, but I think the most controversial piece for MSG is the Sphere, right? And I can go through the history, or I'll let you go through the history of the Sphere, but let's talk about what the Sphere is, what they're doing, why it's so controversial.
Sure. So the history of the Sphere is, stuff about the history. It's funny because it's only like 3 years of development or whatever. I mean, I've been talking about it for
a rocky 3 years though.
So the the sphere is, let me think about it. Where do you want to start with like the controversy in the sphere? Like how much they're going to spend, or what actually is the asset, or what do you want to talk?
Whatever you think is most important. Why don't you give an overview of what the sphere is, and then we can go into the controversy.
Sure. So sphere is and I would point this out when you think about like the company, it's basically an unlevered real estate development, right? So there's a big detail of, I think, the story that people miss when they're talking about cost overruns and all this kind of stuff is like, very rarely do you see someone saying $2 billion into like a real estate play that's a theater. So it's not like you're selling condos, but like we constructed a large building and we did it on an unlevered basis. It's not a very common thing. And that's why I think people might associate more risk to it than if they thought about it on levered versus unlevered type returns in these investments.
Yep.
So the sphere is it's basically a concert venue located in the middle of the strip. It's connected to the Venetian, and who gave them the land actually. And it's also gonna be connected to the Sands Expo Center and all that kind of stuff. There's like Skybridge, all this stuff. What it's supposed to be is basically a state-of-the-art, it's a concert venue, and what they're saying is the concert venue has not been reimagined in a very long time. And so we are gonna build a state-of-the-art concert venue with state-of-the-art electronics, incredible sound, beam-forming technology, which is this type of sound thing that they're talking about, and all of this like super high-tech kind of stuff. And so the kind of pitch is like, are you like an EDM fan at all by any chance?
I'm not really, but
yeah,
I've heard it before.
So the pitch is like, you go to these EDM concerts just to like sort of like zoom out and put a user experience kind of like perspective. Yeah, you go to EDM, and I don't really go to that many EDM concerts, but like you go to them, and like I saw like Diplo at the Brooklyn Mirage in like September or something. During the concert, they project stuff all over the walls. Like there's like imagery, and it's like, it's not as much about like watching a, you know, Hendrix hit a ridiculous note on a guitar with the whole crowd. It's more like, this is an experience. So this is very like DJ pre-recorded kind of music. It's not quite as in the moment with the instruments. And so it becomes a lot of experience. And so there's a lot of like, you know, stuff projected on a lot of walls. There might be a lot of people that are on some substances that are enjoying those walls more than they would otherwise, but like it has this very kind of thing. And so if you go look like on YouTube, like look at Ultra Music Festival or like Electric Zoo or some of these like things, and you see these huge displays with all these light and stuff like that. And they're like, well, that doesn't exist in a stadium because like you have to bring all that kind of stuff. You can't really, you'd have to like knock out all the seats, you know, it doesn't really make any sense. And so part of the concept behind the spheres, and so they're also going to have like, we'll talk more about what they would actually have, but like what they build is a stadium seating, right? Very normal sort of thing, interesting shape, but nothing's going to blow your mind. There's a stage and there's seats and yada yada. It's an interesting shape. And then they have connected basically a giant, like, not scoreboard, what am I looking for? TV, right? It's basically, it is 3 football fields of screens, basically the same quality as your iPhone. For scale, that's about 70 times the size of an IMAX.
Yep.
And so it's a massive like screen. It's going to have these super high, it has this technology called, I believe it's called beamforming technology, to be very specific.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. And so instead of having a speaker up front in the stadium that you just blast really loud, so it's really loud in the front and like really faint in the back, right? They individually target a speaker basically at all the seats so everyone can hear it all at the same sound quality, right? Theoretically, I'm not sure how much some of this technology is really perfectly going to work, which is a fair criticism of the project, but like you're going to be able to like smell stuff, the stuff will vibrate a little bit, and so it's this really immersive world you can create. And so what can you do with that kind of technology? You can, do you want to jump in there, or do you want me to keep going on?
No, I actually, yes, let me jump in. So I think I definitely get where you're headed, right? Like their pitch is, and what you're saying, and I don't disagree, is the sphere is going to be unique. It is going to be, if you are a concert goer, they're saying it will be the best concert experience in the entire world, and that's going to be the draw. Am I kind of summing that up correctly?
Yeah, I think that is basically about right.
So I think the pushback would be great, but people, including myself, are worried that they are lighting money on fire with the sphere. And there are all sorts of interesting things to the sphere, but what I point to, and I put this in my tweet thread when I was prepping for the show notes, if anybody wants to go look at it, you know, when they announced the project about 3 years ago, they said, this project's going to cost us $1.2 billion, and we're going to make a double-digit return on it. And a couple years later, they come out and they say, hey, our contractor thinks it's going to cost 1.7, but that's just the contractor. They get paid on cost. We think it's 1.2. We're going to push them back. And then a couple months later go by, they fire the contractor. A couple months later go by, they say it's going to be 1.8. today, what was supposed to open in 2021 and cost $1.2 billion when they originally projected it, today they're saying it's going to cost almost $1.9 billion, and it's going to open in 2023. Now, part of the delay is COVID, but we're 2 years behind schedule. The money keeps going up and up and up. And I think people are worried. James Dolan famously, he loves music. He tours. MSG has been involved in music stuff before. He loves music. And I think people, including me, are worried that this is a passion project that is being done at no expenses spared. And it's not only is it not the best use of shareholder money, it's lighting money on fire. So what would you say to people including me, with those criticisms?
I'd say the most important thing to do facing those criticisms is look down, not up, at what you're actually buying at the current price, right? Like, this is not price for perfection. So I should have done a probably better job of highlighting this before, but you own the garden on an unlevered basis. We'll talk about how hopefully in a second.
Yep.
But so you own the garden on an unlevered basis, right? So it's 2.7 billion EV here, right? So how much are we really paying conceptually for this sphere anyway, right? So what? All right, so it's gonna have cost overruns. Maybe they are doing. Maybe it's a pet project. Yada yada. And I want to talk about the cost overrun part in a second. But look, I make this point all the time. But do you know the UBS arena?
I don't think so.
Okay, UBS is paying $23 million a year for you to know it. That is the Islanders' new arena on Queens, Long Island, where exactly is. That's the rumor is it's about $23 million. Crypto.com is paying what, 700 million for 19 years, right?
Yep.
I think you might have tweeted it at something, or did we talk? You talked about. Look, this is an asset in the middle of the strip. They're going to get 30, 50 million of marketing revenue out of this thing, no matter what. I think that's a very simple bet. And then you're all right, what else did I get out of this asset, right? I don't know, 100 million bucks. Garden rents for something like $500,000. I think, roughly speaking, is a good number for a night. Whatever. How many concerts? Well, we're going to do 100 shows a year. We sell, you know what I mean? You get to $100 million, I think, pretty convincingly. Is it a fair thing to say the thing only makes $100 million? It's a bust of a development project? Yeah. That's a lousy use of $2 billion over with a 6-year development time frame. That's a terrible use of money, right? But that doesn't mean that it's a terrible buy for me.
Yeah. Yep.
And also, let's pivot right there. So let's pivot right there into the cost side of the thing, right? Or do you want to stop for that or anything?
No, that was perfect. That was perfect.
So on the cost side of things, and what do I actually think on my downside on the sphere looks like from here, right? So it does do I think we can get to $100 million pretty easily. I don't think that's really rocket science math, right? If it does $100 million, what do I think? Do I think everyone's just be cool with that? No, I bet you we end up sinking some more money into the project. You know what I mean? We have, instead of a cost overrun, we have operational overrun. We're the problem is this. I totally get that this is sort of a distraction and potential waste of time thing, right? But still, you'd be talking about $100 million of EBITDA should be reasonable with pretty minimal capex, right? EBIT, whatever kind of way you want to conceptualize it. On the cost side of it, though, and I think this is I actually think you can get paid in the investment before it even ever works when the costs basically kind of come in. And so one of my points I make to people is someone was don't you know steel prices are up? And you're they're done. The steel's already there. Who cares? Right? This building had a topping off. So they have something called in construction a topping off ceremony, which is the highest placed beam in a building being placed. They cut a ribbon and whatever. They did that in June. It's pretty far along. This thing is 70 to 80% complete probably by now, right? And then, all right, so where am I going to hit my cost overruns? The steel's in, concrete's poured. Where is the cost part, right? Well, we have all this high-tech technology that, I'm sure there's a lot of semiconductors in it, and I'm not sure if you've heard, there's apparently some issues with semiconductor capacity at the moment. Yeah, there's some weird stuff. But then I was talking over with a friend who was whatever exactly his title is at when Moynihan Hall was developed. He also did some stuff at the World Trade Center, and he was because the Moynihan Hall is relevant because they have a lot of screens. And he was like a scoreboard for a stadium is 6-month minimum, more 12 months lead time to actually get LG or Samsung or whoever actually you're contracting with to do it. This is a state-of-the-art 3 football. It's the largest scoreboard in the world, to overly simplify it, right? They've already done the bids on it. They likely have down payments on it. Heck, it's probably already a third constructed, or a lot of the parts are made. You know what I mean? They're much further along in this concept in this project. And so I get like people talk about like the SoFi Stadium and sort of these things is like these things that massively overrun. You're like, they didn't massively overrun once everything was already poured, right? Like also you have to think, and I don't necessarily think this is fair to talk about here because they're kind of vague and effusive or whatever, but like the where am I going? A lot of the times in these things that have big overruns, like there's like a scope expansion.
Yep.
Right. Like there's a SoFi Stadium, but there's also like, like 5,000 square feet of like right now, like, office space associated with it. That's not like the stadium. That's like part of this big thing you're trying to do to redevelop this neighborhood, yada, yada. And so I think at this point farther along, I think it's much more reasonable to think about almost all of this stuff is contracted and like fairly decently along the line. I think the concept that something that's 80% completed is going to have a 100% cost overrun on the contractors installing the hand dryers, I think is wildly that's not happening.
It's tough also to get a contractor to install a hand dryer. Hey,
like, yeah, go ahead. No, I was just to finish there with, I think of 10 to 20% of cost overrun here as probably like a realistic, I don't want to say max, but like a realistic, like, that's maybe where we're heading if things kind of come in at the end, right? And I think the more realistic scenario than like a big kind of thing is like, it doesn't hit the EBIT targets you want, and so you end up sticking more money in it down the line. See that, but again, like almost you're talking about, I think like $100 million checks, not like $1 billion checks.
When they first announced the Sphere, it was actually going to be 2 spheres, right? They were going to do one in Vegas, and then they were also concurrently going to do one in London. And they had such big dreams at the time. They were saying these are just the first of the first two, and we're going to build them all over the world, right? They were talking about they were going to have a Sphere franchise. I think that's on the back burner now, but London, they kind of said they had issues with the permitting. They had issues with everything. I haven't heard a lot about London recently. Is London off the table right now, or do you think they're going to do London at some point?
I think the way I think about it is, and I'm pretty sure it's the way they think about it is, let's see how the Sphere does. And so that's sort of,
yeah. I just think the bear case, one of the extreme bear case was, hey, yes, the Sphere. It's not the end of the world if it comes in at $2 billion versus the original projections and it comes in way under target. But I think a lot of people were worried they're going to go do London after this. And, let's say they do a $2 billion Sphere and it ends up the Sphere is only worth $1 billion or something. So they lit $1 billion on fire. I think the worry was they're going to go do another $2 billion one in London and light another $1 billion on fire. And then they'll do one in Chicago and light another $1 billion on fire. But it sounds like they're going to wait and see at this point.
I think that is a much more, I think if it opens and it's a dud, I think it is very unlikely that they would just go sink another $2 billion. You know what I mean? Make the commitment. Like you'd have to sell assets to do it. You know what I mean? It's not, they don't have $2 billion to sink on another Sphere without figuring something out, right?
It's good.
You're not going to find like a credit.
Originally, they were going to do them concurrent, right? And if you think that this is come way over budget and they're burning money, like doing them concurrent would have been 2x as bad, right? So
yeah, but like they also, I mean, like the way they budgeted this, I think if I compare this a lot to like, I don't know the specifics of exactly how Disney World was built, but like, I'm sure at some point someone was like, we're going to make an amusement park ride. What, you know what I mean? What is this thing? And you're like, it's like the Field of Dreams, like you build it and they will come, right? To me, I think there's a healthy degree of skepticism. I think in any investment is important. I think that, this is that entrepreneurial build it attitude, right? And like, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I think they're much more reasonably like cost discipline than people think. I think this is like a big giant thing that they're doing, right? And I get that, like, right, it overlaps with like, James Dolan's music interests and things like that. And you worry that some people who are very wealthy take their hobbies to the next level. And I'm not. I like guitar too, but I'm not building any stadiums at the moment.
Once MSGE goes to your NAV target, though, maybe who knows?
Yeah, we're launching a SPAC and a crypto at the same time.
One other thing I wanted to add on here, and we'll probably discuss it when we talk the Garden too. But you mentioned rights, right? Like at some point, the Sphere, it's going to be, it's probably going to be the most popular venue in Vegas. At some point, somebody's going to pay a top dollar to name the Sphere, I would guess. Mm-hmm. And I also love the Sphere. It's it's a sphere shape, right? But they're putting LED lights on the outside. And they're going to sell advertising. And when you're flying into Vegas, you'll be able to see, because it's so big and they'll have the lights, you'll be able to see the advertisements on it. And I don't know what that will generate, but I could see that going for trophy, because not only are you getting people as they fly into Vegas, but every aerial shot of Vegas is going to have that and everything. I just think that's pretty cool. I think that's cool.
I think the Sphere probably will be really, really cool and probably work pretty well. And we can debate whether or not they're going to make $300 million a year out of the asset. Like, you got to own a lot of content. You're going to have shows that, like they're going to develop in-house. There's like Sphere Ventures, or not Sphere Ventures, it's called there's a Sphere Ventures. MSG Ventures is Sphere Ventures. Can't remember what they call it. But like, they're hiring like people. I believe they hired someone who worked at the Illumination, whatever Disney calls the people that work on rides there. They're building it. You can go see it on YouTube. Like, if it works and they have like build an iconic show, it's they're gonna kill it. Like, there's just, and to me, like the portfolio bet of the company is you own the Garden unlevered, right? The Sphere is basically unlevered, effectively unlevered construction project, right? That they have the cash on balance sheet for, right? And so I don't give them any credit for the cash because it's going into the Sphere, but like, that's that. And you're just like, look, if the Sphere's a bust, I don't know, the stock's probably flat. If the Sphere hits it, like, this thing could be doing 250. You see the projections, right? Like, and like, it could come in better. Like, who knows, right? If this thing's doing 250 million of EBIT, and they can open one in London, there's already planned. And by the way, we could sell some licensing rights to open one in like Macau, or we could put one in, start whoever wants it, right? Like, if it becomes something like that, this thing is, the point is like, there's definitely going to be the pitch, no matter what, that's what's going to happen here, right? This thing's going to trade 20 times EBIT, and like 20 times 250 is 5 billion. There's just no way this thing is worth $2.5 billion with one $5 billion unlevered asset. Like,
what you're telling me, and this makes sense, right? As I was remember this podcast, I was thinking this. You're basically saying, look, this is a heads I win, tails I don't lose much, right? Sphere is a complete bust. You're basically paying nothing for it at current prices, right? You're saying every dollar on their balance sheet right now, they light it on fire into the Sphere. The Sphere is worth zero, and we're not paying anything for it, right? We're just paying for Garden and MSGN. And then if it works, Sphere is going to generate a lot of money, and that is not reflected in the share prices also. Heads, this works, you win. Tails, it doesn't work, break even. Let's turn to the next part. People can go listen to the podcast I did with John Boyer on the MSGE, MSGN deal. He sent a letter to the MSGN board saying he was opposed to it. I was opposed to it. I thought it was one of the stupidest deals I've ever seen. And I think people, when they, I think that's in the past, right? It doesn't matter for future valuation at this point, but it does matter for coming back to, you say the Dolans aren't as bad as people think they are. And I say, well, the MSGN deal was pretty bad. So why don't you talk about what was the MSGN deal just real quickly? And, we can talk about why I hated it, or we can talk about how to look at the company going forward.
Yeah. So MSGN, MSGE deal is basically the regional sports networks for a publicly traded entity previously called MSGN, MSG Networks. It traded basically at the time 5 times leveraged free cash flow. I forget exactly what it came out to on EBITDA, something like 6 probably.
Yeah, that's about right.
And so they basically just did a stock for stock deal at market prices. They just combined them. And so I think it really creates the strong technical entry point, because I think it disappointed both shareholder bases, right? And I think it particularly disappointed the end shareholder bases. But yeah.
MSGE and MSGN were both down on the day of deal announcement. And for you to announce a deal and have both sides go down, it's pretty distressing.
So there's a variety of reasons, I think, that why people dislike the deal. And so very briefly, like, there's a whole podcast where you guys complain about it. So, let's not rehash it too much, right? But like, it's basically, if you're on the networks, you're like, whatever the Yes networks got, you were hoping for that, or you think that the stream is longer than people think, whatever you thought about it, sports betting, whatever. But you're like, I'm buying a cheap stock, 5 times free cash flow. There's some sort of comp that says it should like kill it and rip it upside, right?
Yep.
So instead of getting that happen, I now own the Sphere. And so like, people are like, well, what is the point of this? And MSGE, they were like, well, is this murky, the Dolans, whatever, right? I think you need to take it from the perspective of the Dolans, right? Like, these are separate entities, right? But they're all Dolan controlled at roughly the same economics. There's not very much variance between them, right? And so they're a little bit like, the stock's trading like death. I think in some ways the networks it's certainly heading towards an operational restructuring, right? We can talk about the financing side of it, right? But like, certainly there's a big change coming in this business, right? So it's really not the best asset to just be drifting out there with a bunch of cash. we're paying $20 million a year in like corporate overhead costs to keep a fictional entity that no one wants to buy public. Like, well, who cares? There's immediate tax benefits. And again, like from their perspective, like these guys, a lot of their offices are like shared. Like they have like the same coffee makers at points. Like that's like the thing I asked. Like, where do you guys get coffee? I was like, it's kind of the same room. Like they're not, from the Dolan's perspective, like I own it already. It's not going to change anything about how these businesses are really operating, frankly. Like we can like structure a legal agreement to have like a cost share, but at the end of the day, like it's just 3 office floors in Midtown Manhattan. And you know what I mean? Like it's not as legal. I think it's less of a big deal to them because they have the same economics and there was some cost saves.
So I hear you, and I don't want to rehash this whole thing, but I just want to push back on one point of that. You say, oh, it wasn't a big deal to them. They own them all on roughly the same size. And I get that. But, you know, MSG, the whole company was all together. The networks, the sports teams, and the entertainment teams. 5 years ago, they were all together. They spun out the networks, and then they split sports and entertainment. And then they decided at the height of COVID, when MSGE, they've got the cash on the balance sheet, but it's not like they were cash rich. They've got this huge fear project. They decided at the height of COVID, let's merge these two together so that we've got a cash flow asset with it. And I think everyone who looked at MSGN would say it makes no sense to marry the networks to the arena side, right? Like it would make sense to marry the networks back to the sports side. Lots of people love teaming the networks up with the sports team or just selling the networks to a strategic player. But I don't know anyone who thought the natural marriage was E with N, right? So my pushback would be, okay, let's say I buy what you're saying and they don't really care. They still did the least logical deal here, you know?
They did the most logical deal for them. So there's no tax benefit to attaching the networks to the MSGS piece because the sports teams operate at break even roughly. So
yeah.
Sports, I think it's important when you're thinking about the networks to think about, and I think the very critical detail I think that people miss when they're thinking about the networks piece is that it's the Dolans own the teams and the thing. And so it's a very different thing than like Sinclair owning the RSN in Los Angeles for the Dodgers. I think it's very different. But like, so sports team, basically what you do is you give half the revenues that go to the players, right? And then you run the rest of the business at break even. And then it's effectively, there's some like tax dodges that really rich people figure out. But like, it's basically like a Rembrandt with an operating company. And you're basically, I'm sure some people would disagree with this, but in my opinion, you're just speculating some rich person will buy it off you later, right? The value of the sports goes up.
Historically, it's been a good bet though. Historically, it's been a very
totally worked. But like, really rich people get bored and it's pretty cool to own a sports team. Like Steve Ballmer's having a great time in Los Angeles. You know what I mean? Like
everyone not that I'm personally friends with sports teams owner, but everyone I know who knows a sports team owner or something or buys it, all of them say the most fun they've ever had in their life comes when they buy the sports team. And they, you become the most important person in your community. You're nationally known. Like it's way more fun owning a sports team than doing just about anything else.
Yeah, Rihanna doesn't hang out with that many like 68-year-old dudes. You know what I mean? Like courtside at the Clippers or Lakers or whatever. But yeah.
So that covers I think you did a nice job of covering this is why the MSGN MSG deal wasn't that bad. So let's go to the next thing. Since the deal, I'm talking on both sides of my mouth here, right? Because the first thing I said was the MSGN MSG deal stuck. The next thing I'm going to say is since the deal went through, the value of MSGN I think has definitely taken a hit, right? They got dropped from Comcast. The outlook for RSNs, it sounds crazy to say this, but in the past 3 or 4 months, the outlooks for regional sports networks has just gone to crap in general. It's gotten even worse. We're seeing lots of blackouts. Again, Comcast dropped MSGN. Sinclair's probably going to have to restructure their RSN. So the outlook's gotten worse. So how do you look at the value on, it's smaller, it's lower multiple, but the networks definitely, they issued a lot of shares and there is value here. So if you completely wipe this out at zero, that's a pretty big haircut.
Yeah. So the way I think about, let's talk about like the regional sports networks, like business model in general, right?
Sure.
And so yeah, I couldn't be more historically bearish on the legacy RSN business model. So for people who don't know, it's distributed over cable, so it's part of the bundle, right? The sneaky thing about it is it's basically one of the most expensive parts of the bundle. And the concept of the bundle is almost every bundle in the United States historically was purchased by a 4-person household, which has a man who watches sports. And so basically in the concept of the organism that was and remains sort of is, but like, let's face it, is on its way out, the cable bundle. Like there are certain parts of the bundle that over monetize, right? And so like Fox News over monetizes because like I might never watch Fox News, but someone who watches Fox News might watch it every day religiously, and they'll literally cancel their cable package over it. So Fox News gets to hike price every year. That's how it works, right? And the way the sports networks works is very similar, right? If I have options, you typically only had one option, which would be cable, and then you would also have, let's say, dish or satellite, right? But the reality is, like, if I can't get the Knicks games and dish, if I don't get the Knicks games on Comcast, I cut off the Rangers games, right? I'm a diehard Rangers fan. The first thing that happens is Dish contacts me historically and is like, "Do you want an introductory offer for a deal?" And then like I switch because all I give a shit about or crap about is like getting my I'm one of this household, I care and I want this, right? And so they had great pricing power. And so the problem is that for MSGN specifically, the networks, I think they're making right now about $10 a month per sub. I think that's a good number. And so you're like, okay, $10 a month per sub right now. Theoretically, it's not fully distributed anymore. So the whole business model is very different, right? But like, well, I forget exactly what Disney Plus charges right now, but like 15, 16. I forget what I'm paying for Netflix at this point. Assign that that's a good business, but like, like $14, right? And you're like, so I get all the movies available on Netflix and all the shows and the comedy specials and all that stuff, or I can watch 80 games of the Rangers, right? Like for almost the same price. You're like, well, it feels like I'm getting way less. And you have this whole, and so what happens is historically they over monetize in this ecosystem. This ecosystem's dying. We have to go to market in this new ecosystem where our product is very awkwardly positioned relative to many of the players in the ecosystem. And even if like the 10-year forward outlook for Disney Plus is maybe it's $35 a month, right? Like, maybe this thing doesn't look quite as cheap on outer year kind of concept for what is going to happen in this ecosystem. It's still basically facing this very difficult go-to-market, how do we price and package our product?
I agree with you. Can I add two more things? And I don't mean to step on you. This is just an area I spent a lot of times in. I think you hit the nail on the head. The other two issues I think they run into is one, you said MSGN charges about $10 per sub, right? Well, they charge it of all subs, but for Comcast, let's say 10. I think actually Comcast in the press release they put out said only 5% of our viewers watch MSGN networks with any type of consistency. So they're charging $10 per month. But what they're actually doing is the one person, like if you watch sports, they're getting $120 per month from every sub who actually watches sports, if you do that math, right? Yeah. So what's happening, it's 200, right? 5%, 200 on 10. So what happens is they're in this weird thing where if they switch to direct, they would technically, if every person who was in the legacy bundle signed up for them to be revenue neutral, they'd have to charge in that scenario $200 per month, which nobody's going to pay $200 per month for. So that's number one. And then number two, people are really nervous. They've got some debt, but all the payments that MSGN Networks makes to the sports teams are fixed, right? So if enough people cut the cord, you get really bad negative operating leverage trends real quick, where you go from 10 million subs to 4 million subs while your payments to the Knicks and Rangers stay the same and your income statement can get reversed real quick. Do you want to add anything to those comments?
I think that's completely the right model to think about why an RSN is stressed. And I would actually add one more weaker argument for an RSN, which is you might not technically own the streaming rights.
And that was a big topic for MSGN and all RSNs, but I'd encourage anyone, go read the last earnings call for MSGN. Big topic at MSGN saying, we've got the rights, don't worry about it. We might have to pay a little bit more to solidify them, but we've got the rights. We can go direct to consumer when we need to, which was very interesting.
So I think that's so to me, there's two things, and we'll get to the other one, obviously, which is the sports betting angle for the RSNs. But the thing that is interesting is I think it's interesting relative to a lot of things that are declining media asset type businesses, right? The Weather Channel, whatever you want to insert as like the clear loser of like where the ecosystem's going, right? So there's two really interesting things. And one is, I think, related to all RSNs, and the second thing is related specifically to MSGN. It's related to all RSNs is the demand for their product is actually not down, right? Like if truly the Knicks and Rangers, I don't think anyone thinks the NBA is on its way out, right?
Yep.
And so it's not really a product where like John Hamm was great on Mad Men, and that show was on AMC, which is Dolan. But he could just be on a show on Netflix. Like, fundamentally, it doesn't really matter. Like if all the talent and production moves over to like some other network, this channel can be completely cut out of a new model, right? LeBron is not playing in the Canadian Basketball Association because like streaming, you know what I mean? Like there's no competing kind of thing. Knicks and Rangers tickets, right? Like they still sell out. They take price. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's no real slow in demand for this product. It's not really an issue of disintermediation, and it's not really an issue of secular decline of the asset, right?
Mm-hmm.
The asset is the Knicks and Rangers and people wanting to watch those games, right? This is part of that ecosystem, right? And how it's going to market. And so it's really less that they're being disintermediated so much as we need a new business strategy to hit these sort of targets. And it's not like there's a rival technology coming in and taking market share. We run the innovator's dilemma and all these other like things that people talk about that happen in these secular downturns. Or, yeah. So I think that's just a very different thing about the RSN business, where it's much more like we know there's demand for this product,
Yep.
right? You could very clearly see it. The Knicks games are still sold out, and they take price on tickets, right? So you just have to figure out how to monetize the thing. And so I'm very open to concepts of they under monetize in the new world, right? Like it was over monetized in the past, and there's a new normal, right? But whatever that new normal is still probably growing. I don't know, GDP plus. Probably 2x GDP for live experiences and new fan engagement and whatever, right? And so I think it's not a cutout business per se, being generally what people at home or at bars watching games, right? I do not think that there's really secular change happening in that. We're figuring out what to connect the TV to, not really whether or not we want to watch the content.
Yeah, no, look, I generally agree with everything you just said. I might quibble here or there, but for the purpose of the podcast, I'd say I agree with 95% of what you just said. So I think that was perfect. So let's talk about MSGN. They just bought the company. We can talk about the upside from sports rights, which are coming, which also applies to the Garden side as well, which we'll discuss in a second. Or we can just talk valuation, outlook, whatever you want to talk about. How do you think about MSGN now? The deal is done, right? The deal's done. So how are we looking at it?
The one critical thing I'll just point about, because we're going to get into MSGN in 1 second, but the other critical thing just to think about when you're comparing it to other RSNs, right? Like, so you commented on the call that everyone was asking, like, are you sure you have the rights? You sure you have the rights? Because that's very relative to Sinclair, which is really the only other publicly traded comp that people look at, right?
Yep.
Because the league, the MLB was like, we don't think they have the rights, right? That's why I was asking.
And it shouldn't have come as a surprise to Sinclair, because when Sinclair was buying them, the league also stepped in and said, you guys don't have digital rights. So I don't know why it's a surprise to them now.
It's everything's a negotiation. Here's the thing: the Dolans own the Knicks and Rangers. They don't own the Sabres, so don't get me wrong. This does not apply to the Sabres part of the MSG Networks model per se. It may or may not apply, and they would be in the same sort of argument situation. But like when they're like, "Are you sure you have the rights?" You're like, "Who else would have the rights?" But you're saying that MSGS has the rights. MSGS is on the call. They're the same people. They own both. Like, you know what I mean? They're like, this is what the Dolans say. They say the MSGE owns the streaming rights. Like, who else is going to have it? Like, Adam Silver has like conned all the owners into like something, and he's going to run away with a package. And like, no, they're like, yeah, we have the rights. Like,
it would be a billion-esque plot, right? Adam Silver brings Dolan a room, says, go tell the market that MSG has all the rights to it. We'll buy up all the MSGS stock, and then we'll say MSGS has the digital rights to it. That would be fun.
No. So I think like you're getting into a restructuring of this thing. And so let's talk MSGN, but like financial, but much more so operationally, I think. And we can talk about whether or not they're going to financially restructure. But like your counterparty is the rights of the MSGS, and you're basically on the same side. And so like the point is like this is very different than heading into restructuring, where like the Dodgers do not necessarily care about what is now the Bally's network, but was Fox, whatever Sports, Los Angeles, whatever that was called. Right, like they're not necessarily on the same page. Right here, we're like we're not just on the same page. We are literally the same page. It's the same thing, right? It's the same family, and so you just have much more of a let's figure this out sort of thing was what's going to happen, rather than like a let's fight it to death, or Sinclair style, right?
Yep.
So MSGN, the structure itself is a $1 billion term loan. They actually have cash pledged against it, I'm sure, but whatever that is doesn't really matter for this discussion. Just think about it as a $1 billion term loan. And then they have their stream of EBITDA, call it $200 million, whatever exactly you think it's going to end up looking like in say 2 years, whatever exactly you want to think. And that is declining because cable subs are coming down, right?
Yep.
The way I think about this business is that business model is dying. It's definitely going away. If it goes away faster than we hope, so like Comcast doesn't sign back up and, you know, we get pushback for even Verizon just resigned, but, you know, and so like you can have some pushback around there. Maybe it declines faster and needs to be restructured sooner. Maybe Comcast comes back and maybe it looks a little bit better than people think, whatever, right? But certainly we need to develop a different strategy, right? And I'd also point out, when you're thinking about this, it's also really important for the leagues, right? Like people can't, like, it is not good that like cable viewership of RSNs for like, I think it's the under 30 demographics down like 70.
Yep.
There's no way kids not watching the NBA is good for the NBA in a 30-year time horizon.
You get into this is an issue. They've been saying it for baseball for several years, and it creeps up on you, and then it's sudden, right? Kids are your lifeblood, and if you're not forming a connection with kids when they're 12 or probably 7, actually, they're 98% of the time they're not going to become fans out of nowhere when they're 25 or 30, right? You need to get them now. So if you're a league, it's like investing, it's customer acquisition costs, right? You need little kids watching your product, or else you're taking away from the lifeblood of your product.
Yeah. And so right now, though, thinking about it is like kids are watching it. They watch it on YouTube. You get clips. You can see it on Twitter. There's Instagram channels. I don't pay for Sixers. I don't currently pay for the out-of-market package on the NBA League Pass for the Sixers. It was my thing. I probably watched 5 minutes of every game this season. That's an exaggeration. Yep. I skipped plenty of the lousy games, but like I've watched plenty of Sixers basketball without paying for it, right? And so they're not necessarily not engaged. Even it's more just, all right, so how do we figure this out? And so the point is, this is a media asset where the end market I don't think is down. I don't even think viewership is truly down as much as people think it is. I think the distribution pay model of the previous thing is down a lot more. And so how do we get from here to the future? And like, what does it look like? So this is where I think the two obvious answers, right, are we need a direct to market OTT strategy. So we need to figure out a way to stream it and go to market, right? And then sports betting. So let's talk about the OTT thing real quick first, even though this is basically all we've talked about. But like so they used to have roughly 8 million subs in the New York area, right? They have something like, certainly it's gonna, I forget exactly what the math is, but like we're heading towards 4 or already at 4 or something like that. It's a huge amount of like decline over a decade period. This business, I think, would fundamentally turn around from if they managed to get a DTC package together that earned them 100 million of EBIT, and there should be pretty high drop through in revenue to EBIT, just to make this argument simple here, because they already have the apps all built out, and you're just adding a payment layer, right? The MSGN network app is, you can have it on your phone. You might have it on your phone. I don't know.
I do have it on my phone.
Yeah, so like literally, they just have to add like a billing layer. It's not as difficult as like starting a brand new business. It already exists. Yep. It's just a matter of monetizing it, right? So that means there's 4 million households that used to have it, right? People are saying that they're going to price depending upon which market, say $20 a month, right? Or like $200 a year. And if you go look at like the NBA app or NBA All Access Pass, that's kind of like what they price the out of market stuff at.
Yep.
But so say $250 a year. We used to have 4 million subs, right? If you get 500,000 of those subs, right? We're already a lot of the way into turning this business fundamentally around. And you're like, 4 million of them used to pay for it already. You know what I mean? Like I get that like 5% only watched it. How many of them are still, there's a relative question of how many of these people who are still on the network are really there for sports teams too. So you do have some go-to-market problems, right? But like you could also start restricting clips. You know, what do the leagues want to do? Do they want to pair and have like an ESPN? If there's going to be a true unbundling and sports is going to go have this OTT thing, that's going to be ESPN and people are going to pay for that. And then you have add-in packages of sports teams you want to watch, whatever it is. But like, look, there's 20 million plus people in the New York metro area, right? There's people, I do wonder exactly how much MSGN gets paid for the broadcasts out of market for the league pass, right? Like there isn't like I do not subscribe to Comcast cable in Philadelphia, but I watch whatever the heck that thing is called when I sign up for the Sixers game at, right? There is an out of market, local market element to what is maybe happening here, right? And certainly, MSGN, like they hire, what's his name? Clyde Frazier, right? Who does the broadcast? I can't remember.
It's Clyde and who's the playback? Mike Green.
Yeah. So like, I mean, someone's got to pay them. Like if you want to watch, this model needs that. And so to me, I'm like, look, I get there's a lot of stress right now, But like in the next 3 years, I'm like, I bet you they just kind of figure out some sort of like DTC, OTC sharing. And the reality is that like if the MSGS guys need to take a cut, they're probably going to end up taking a cut. So what does that restructuring look like, right? Like when you're really paired against someone and fighting dramatically, right? Like they look really ugly. We're not really paired and fighting against this. Everyone, all it's kind of the same. And so it's much more consensual. And like,
I just want to push back on one point, right? So you said, hey, we go into, you laid out, right? If you think the bundle's falling apart, at some point, this needs to be a direct to consumer business, right? And I 100% agree with what you're saying there. But I think the pushback would be, they were so over earning in the bundle, it's going to be very difficult for them to, make the DTC switch. So I'm just looking, right? Like I'm using 2020 numbers because that was a little bit before they hadn't given back all the revenues from COVID and everything yet, but they did about 700 million in revenue, MSG networks, and 300 million in operating income, right? If you're going to a bundle, like it's hard for me to see more than 1 million people paying for the sports network. I mean, they don't get 1 million people watching every game. So let's just say 1 million people paying $200 a year, that's 200 million in revenue. There's expenses associated with that, right? 100 million a year goes to the sports team. It just, this is a business that did 300 million in operating income. And in that model I laid out, at some point, earnings go down to 75 million, 100 million in that scenario. Like that's a really big decline.
It's totally huge. I'd also point out that this scenario is also that you're laying out is where you're saying like NBA players are going to make less money in the future.
No, well
the
NBA
league revenue side and the ticket revenue side is going to grow,
NBA players because the league revenue's gone down. Yeah.
You're also, that's why I point that out, is just like, I'm like, you're also implying something that like people don't actually believe, right? Like most people don't expect the best player in the NBA to make less money a decade from now. But like if there's no monetization of local sports rights, they're gonna, like that's how it's gonna work. Like,
yeah.
And so
okay.
Go.
Oh, no, I agree with you. I do want to turn because we've got a lot more to talk about, but I just want to, MSGN networks, we talked the bear side, right? The bear side is revenues declining, subscribers declining, all this sort of stuff. The upside is sports betting's on the way. And you know what the best way to get to acquire sports betting customers, and the end game might even be the best way to gamble. The best way to acquire, the best way to gamble, it's probably to go to the people who are watching the regional sports network and advertise to them, get them. I mean, I always was a big MSGN bull because I thought at some point in-game betting is going to come, and the best way to do it will be on the MSG Go app. And you just say, hey, I bet, Julius Randle is going to make a 3-pointer on the next possession or something while you're watching the game. But why don't you just quickly talk about how sports betting could be a big turnaround for MSG networks and MSG as a whole?
So if you're thinking about sports betting, so rough numbers are in England, the UK, the average person between sports betting and iGaming spends about $200 a year of gross gaming revenue, which means net out of all of their bets, they lose $200.
Yep.
There are 300 million people roughly in the United States, 330, whatever it is, right? Put it all together, you get like a $70 billion market, let's say. It's very nascent right now, but that's kind of a TAM estimate. I'd also point out the GDP per capita is higher in the US, but whatever. So it's a giant market, right? In Europe, they spend about 25%, and there's puts and takes to this, but they spend about 25% of gross gaming revenue in ads and marketing, right? That's a huge amount of money. It's like whatever that comes out to, like $18 billion, something like that, right? Somewhere around there. So there's a bunch of ad dollars about to be spent. And so I actually try to do this all the time, but like if you go on your phone and you go to like the ESPN app, right? You scroll through it. Basically, this is a live feed of sports stuff. It's not a regional sports network, but it's 100% a sports focused thing, right? And like this app on my phone with all of these live sports, with all this commentary, with all this publishing, with all of this stuff, video, whatever, right? Video's a little different, but like is being supported by this like banner ad for like Dos Equis. You know what I mean? And I'm like, Dos Equis is a brand building experience. It's supposed to think the world's most interesting man, drinking Coronas on the beach, beautiful women, boats, whatever is happening in the ad, right? But like, clearly I'm not building a brand by this little sliver of a banner ad across like this app, right? You know what that app is really valuable towards? Push this thing to bet $5 that like, with 5-to-1 odds that like, Giannis hits a double-double, right?
The thing I always,
monetization, you're good. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing I always said was, do you remember in like, it was 2014 or 15 when daily fantasy sports, not gambling, daily fantasy sports, DraftKings, FanDuel really got, I would watch ESPN and the only advertisements literally would be go bet DraftKings, go bet FanDuel. And that is a lot lower monetization than gambling. My argument was always, when gambling is legalized in New York, every ad on MSGN is going to be go do this. And they, you know, you saw with the Sinclair stuff, you can talk about it. Sinclair rebranded all their networks, all their RSNs to Bailey's, and Bailey's paid a huge sum to get that rebranding. So I think there's lots of value there. Do you want to talk about how you look at like the Sinclair Bailey's deal for MSGN?
Yeah. So like the model, if you want to do digging on it, is the Sky Bet model in the UK, where like Sky Bet branded with like Sky TV, which is like their big sports network over there. And like they went from like 0 to like 20% of like the market. They're just killed it, right? And so it's just, you're watching the sports, you're watching them explain the odds to you, yada, yada. It's just a really, the CPM price of like what is happening on a sports network is direct marketing dollars for the sports betting platforms, and everything else is just vague brand building. To them, it is the Google over monetizes in search to like, you type in like 2021, like Lexus, New York State insurance. Like the whole business model is like, those guys pay up through the teeth for that, because like, this is my client and I need to be there. So sports gaming, these are my clients and I need to be there. And so it totally changes it. The way I think about it for them is, we can talk about whether they rebrand the networks. We can talk about whatever that is, right? Like the very simple thing that they're doing right now is they're just signing up marketing partnerships with people, right? And they like kind of say that they expect it to be one of their top verticals, right? And they kind of point out that they think sports betting in general will be a top vertical, quote unquote, like one of their top relationships. And they're like, you know, they'll like tell you like, look at what publicly quoted stuff for like JP Morgan is. So JP Morgan has a partnership to be branded. There's a section, they have suites at like Madison Square Garden, $30 million. That should be like 80%, you know, you already have the teams in place. Like how hard is it to do, right? Like right now, like Caesars is partnering with them. They're going to have a show on MSGN networks with JB Smooth. What's he in? Curb?
I don't know.
Yeah, he's in one of the shows. He's partnered with Caesars generally, but he's like a Knicks guy. And so like they're going to be on the show. And
JB Smooth. That's it.
Yeah. They're going to show you, he's going to explain the odds to you. There'll be entertainment assets, but it's, you know, they'll have, I'm sure there'll be some Gladiator reference because it's Caesars or whatever the heck, right? Like they're signing up these partnerships and like, you're already talking about tens of millions in very high margin revenue on 200 million in EBIT, right? Like, and we're like, we're just getting started, right? Like you don't know exactly where the New York market specifically will go with like regulation and players and how much they end up spending on marketing, but like it's big and it's coming, right? And like you point out, like Bally's or whatever, like the Fox News portfolio, which is now Sinclair, is like 30 things. It's a big thing, but like Sinclair owns like 15% with an option to buy 15% more of the company. They gave like a third of the business to get this marketing funnel. And so it's just this huge turnaround in monetization for these assets. And so like, while ultimately the future is like, how do we go direct? I think you're talking about a realistic 30, 50, you know, if you think about the New York market for 20 million people, if you think there's 70 billion of like gross gaming revenue to come, we're 8% of the US population. We're at like $4 billion of like, that like spend. And so if 25% of that's going to be spent on like sports marketing, like, yeah, football is number one, don't get me wrong, but like football is only 16 games, right? Like there's lots of games. You have gamblers. I think there's very few people who are high value gaming customers who only bet football. There's only so many games, right? Versus everything else, there's a lot more. And so it's truly, I'm like, the future is OTT, but in between then and now, there is a huge monetization, a huge amount of ad dollars about to come to the New York market. And MSG Networks, there's only a couple things to really spend your money on. You know, there's really are very few and they want to spend a lot. So,
and I think the same is going to apply to MSGE as a whole at some point, you know, especially Madison Square Garden. I think that's got really interesting. You and I have talked about it. You mentioned earlier, Staples Center got rebranded the Crypto Center or whatever. They're paying, I think it's 25 million a year or something for that partnership. MSG, if you rebranded the Garden to Crypto Center, what would they pay for the Crypto Garden or whatever? It would be more. But let's we're running a little bit long here, but there's a lot of other stuff I want to touch on. So just real quickly, you know, the headliners here for value are the Garden, the Sphere, and the networks. And we've touched on two of the three. I don't think we've talked a ton about the Garden. We'll change that in a second. But Rockettes and Tao, I think Rockettes, are underrated when people think about valuation, because I view the Rockettes as an annuity, a brand. They haven't been successful in expanding the brand, but I view it as an annuity. I think that's a great business. And then Tao, I've always had trouble. I posted the quote in my tweet thread. Tao's on $100 million EBITDA per year run rate.
Yeah.
And it's a tough business to value because it's more hip nightclub. Restaurants are never going to get a great value, but I always look at something like Tao, which is a little hipper and where it's more prone to fad risk. So I just want to toss over you, touch on the valuation, your thoughts on Tao and Rockettes real quick.
So I think one of the things I should have started off at the top is to just walk through the free cash flow math on what like those businesses are for the thing. I think I should at some point, but like because I think it really highlights like the value, because you can argue like what multiple should Tao trade, but you're like, well, it's still making $100 million. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot, and we're only talking about like a $2.5 billion. You know what I mean? Like it's like it's real. It shows up real quickly, and like we're not even talking about it because it's so small part of the story, but it's a real number, right? Yeah, I think the bad risk for nightclubs is kind of there, against which like when I first got to the city, Marquee was like the hot club that I never went to, that everyone had to wait in line for. Still is. I don't know. Like it hadn't changed that much.
My mom, when she came to visit me, we went to Tao, and they've got the giant fortune cookies with like kind of chocolate icing inside, and she still talks about the giant fortune cookie, and it's still very popular. So
they do a good job. And it does make sense as part of an integrated entertainment asset, right? Because like, you're going to want a high roller, whatever high roller means in sports betting, but you know what I mean? Like, but like, you're going to be able to have these packages. Like there's a bit.
I never believed in the synergies they pitch, but they're probably there. What about the Rockettes? How do you look at the Rockettes?
I think Rockettes are great. So the numbers are like, I think they said 130 in revenues in 2019, right around there, something like that. They do like 1 million tickets. It's kind of a staggering number of people going in a non-COVID year.
Before COVID, I mean, basically, before COVID, I said annuity because they do 1 million tickets. They do 1 million tickets every year. Basically, every show is sold out. They can raise prices just about every year. Like I looked at it as one of the best annuities, a very secretly great asset. CapEx
light. It's like to phrase it oddly, it's like owning Lady Gaga, but you don't have to pay her as much, right? Like the Rockettes, like don't like. I hope they get paid a fair wage and all that kind of stuff, but like clearly the Rockette, an individual Rockette dancer does not demand like $4 million to like show up on the stage, right? Like normally what happens in live entertainment acts, like, the Rolling Stones, if you could buy the IP and like own it as a, whatever, is like amazing. Being Mick Jagger is amazing. He has mansions, things are great, right? But like the Rockettes are in a very different light, but they're seasonal holiday, recurring revenue. There are people who go every year. I went one time. There were people in the front row that had like the gear, like all that stuff. Like it's a thing. Like, and they make probably something like, depending upon how they don't tell you exactly, but you get somewhere between like 40 to 60 million probably.
That's what I had in my head, and I think there are old notes that suggested something similar. But
they give you 130 million in revs, and then you have to they don't tell you margins, and so you can take a stab at it. But like, I'd be shocked if it's less than 35. You know what I mean? Like, it's just.
And so that's the whole thing, right? And you look at that again. I use the term annuity many times, but
yeah, it is
capital light, very dependable outside of a COVID year. That's a business that's probably worth, if you put that on the market, I bet you somebody would pay 15 times for it. Yeah. And you said about 50 million earnings, 15 times, that's 750. This is a less than $3 billion company. The math adds up real quickly. Last piece of value I want to touch on, the garden itself. Tax assessed for, I believe, $1.2 billion or so in 2011, 2012 range. There's always debates around the air rights and the value there. There's always debates around, hey, what happens when Penn Station gets remodeled? Is that good? Is there a horse move and stuff? We're running quite long, so I don't want to spend enormous amounts of time there, but why don't you talk to me about how you look at the garden?
I think the garden, so there's two real ways to look at it. I think one is, I comp it to the Nets arena. Real quick to just get there. If you comp it, so the Nets arena has somewhat fewer seats and is like a small arena, and they also have the Hulu, not arena, theater attached to this, right?
MSG does, not
MSG,
Brooklyn. MSG has the Hulu arena attached, which I saw the Grinch at one Christmas, actually.
Oh, did you? Nice. I saw Louis C.K. there. I'm not sure if
there you go.
So yeah, but the so the Nets arena sold for, like, roughly speaking, $1 billion. If you per square foot, per seat adjusted, depending on how you think it, you'd roughly just gross that up to like 1.5, let's say, very quickly. I actually bothered to do this because we were talking about the Sixers before. So the Sixers play the Nets next Thursday, right? The cheapest ticket available on Ticketmaster right now is $30. The Nets and the Sixers are like 2 of 3 or 4 teams that could possibly actually make a run to make it to the championship out of the East, right? The Sixers play the Knicks in February, as of an hour ago when I checked the ticket prices. No offense to Julius Randle, I don't think anyone really thinks there's a chance that he's going to hoist the trophy at the end of the year, right? The minimum ticket price is $130.
Can I
So
add
my point
on
is,
to that?
I'm just, yeah.
So I like the point you're making here. I do think it's a little. I think it's tough to comp Nets prices to Knicks price, right? Because the Knicks just have more fans. But that's exactly the point, right? Because MSG, it's attached to the Knicks. It's in the center of Manhattan, whereas Barclays is nice. It's right off a bunch of subway lines, but it's out in Brooklyn. MSG is the only arena in the center of Manhattan. It's got the Knicks there. It's going to command premium pricing. And the other thing is Barclays, I don't believe it's like they do concerts and stuff there, I think, but it's nothing like every night at MSG. There's something. Sometimes there's 2 things. You know, they'll have pro bull riding during the day, and then they'll have a concert at night. Like, I love the comp you did to get to that 1.5 billion math. But you and I both know, and everyone knows, MSG would command a huge premium to Barclays because of all those things we just laid out, which I think is where you were going with that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just, they did, the quote online is 320 shows in 2019. I didn't individually count that up, but I saw a quote on Wikipedia. But they constantly have shows, only stadium in Manhattan. When they talk about redeveloping Penn Station, they throw like a 1.6 billion, just like reconstructing it down the street.
Yep.
Like cost estimate, which likely overshoots anyway. So you're like, the point is like, and I really lean in, and the other way to think about it is they pay roughly 41 million to the MSGS piece right now. They split the food and beverage revenues and merch revenues from like games, right? And so that's probably just called another 10 million. I think that's about right. There's 20% food and bev to ticket sales ratios. So we're at $50 million from like that business. A lot of the value goes to MSGS, but all the other assets comes to this, plus the Beacon Theater, plus like, you know what I mean? Like, I think like the numbers are masked from the growth of the Sphere and the cost of it if you look at it historically, right? But like, I think MSG probably makes like 100 million plus a year of actual to this business cash, right? And then, what do I think it's worth? I don't know, 20 times it. It has some air rights that are probably worth 200 to 400 million just based upon what the Grand Central air rights sold for. You very conservatively get to this like $2 billion number without really scratching your head too much. I think we can debate holdco, discount, all that kind of stuff. And so the reason I highlight it so much, because I think it's so important to the pitch for MSGE, is it's unlevered because by NBA rules, they're not allowed to put leverage on the stadium. And so like you own an iconic asset with very clear pricing power, with very clear demand, the world's most famous arena, to quote them. And you're paying like, I don't know, 20 times, probably less, at like a replacement cost-ish value. You're like, it's very hard to see how this business, MSGE stock, if you thought about it truly through all the pockets, would ever really, if you liquidated it, be worth less than the current price. It's very, very difficult. And so that means that if it were to sell off the new variant, whatever exactly, if it's down 30, you could just buy more. Like it will eventually have value. Like these assets are strong assets. Like
I don't disagree with any of that, though. I have thought if it's down 30, you can just buy more several times in the past couple of months and seen it gone down another 30. So look, I think we've covered everything here. I wanted to walk through a quick sum of the parts math with you, but before we do that, are there any pieces of this thesis? I think we've covered a ton, but are there any pieces of this thesis you think we missed? You wish we had covered a little harder, anything like that?
I think really, the only thing I'm criticizing myself for at this moment is not bringing up some of the parts math in the front part of the thing rather than the last thing or whatever.
I never know if I should do it in the front or the back of the show, but I thought because we said under 3 billion EV and we started off by just, I thought we did nice, but let's talk. I've got the cap structure and everything pulled up right here. So Garden, I think we said, ignoring air rights, I think you said $1.5 billion. Do you want to use that as the valuation, or would you go
I just used 2 as a good base level. I'm like, I just used like the comp to Barclays and then being like, it's clearly worth more than Barclays.
$2 billion. Okay.
Worth more than Barclays.
For our listeners, I'm literally plugging this into a spreadsheet as we talk. Air rights to MSG. Do you just want to include that in the $2 billion?
Throw that in the Garden's
worth money. And I believe the Garden, there's the Hulu theater next to it. The value there's value, but I don't know how to separate it. It's not big in the grand scheme of things. The Sphere, how do you want to value the Sphere?
I think the way I would value it is 1.5 billion, let's say, in like a bear case, right?
1.5 billion.
If
Perfect.
you want to, you threw out $1 billion before, just to like to illustrate how easy this thing is to like, I think wrap your heads around why you want to own it at this price. Just throw $1 billion in. Let's just shave it by 30%. Shave my bear by 30.
$1 billion. MSGN networks. How much do you want to value that at?
Let's say it's where they paid $1 billion for it to say it's worth 500 million now.
500 million. Great. Rockettes.
Let's say it is worth like $750 million. I think
750.
Like, yeah.
And then Tao 500.
Yeah, what are we saying? It's like, well, they're trending more like 100 million. I mean, I get the pull back.
They don't own all of it, right? I can't remember what the NCI on it is.
Yeah, there's a bit of go 500. Sure.
500. Okay. So for everyone, the big assumptions there we made were MSGN Networks, $500 million, which this is a business that, remember, a couple of years ago was doing 300 million. It is melting for sure, but there's really interesting rights. One of the things I loved about MSG Networks is they own the rights to the Knicks and the Rangers for the next 15 years. A lot of the RSNs that you look at only own them for the next 2 or 3. So they've got long-term rights. So we're way underpricing the networks versus what they just transacted at. And the Sphere, which they're going to sink $2 billion of capital into almost, we're valuing at $1 billion. So that's a big haircut there. If I put all of that together, my per share, some of the parts value that I come out with is $130 per share. Is that sounding about correct to you?
Yeah. And I would say that I'm saying that all those other ones were EV calculations besides MSGN, right? Where I'm saying it's worth 500 million, there's a term loan. But if you wanted to, because we just did it, like you would just put a 0 for MSGN and say it was like a horrendous decision, right? And you would get like you'd get like still over $100 a share is the point.
Because I'd have to back out the term loan in that because they do walking away. Yeah. So
everything else is unlevered. Yeah.
I think we've done a great job here. We walked through all the different parts. It took us almost an hour and a half, but we went through all the different parts. We got through some of the parts. I think we did a nice job. I would have loved to talk networks for another hour because I love talking networks, but I think we did a really nice job covering the bull, the bear case. Again, anything else you want to talk about before we wrap this up?
The last closing point, just because of these assets will still have cash flow. And so you're thinking about like that, like discount, you're like, when is it going to trade, Dolan discount, all that stuff? Like they're going to start buying back stock probably in 2023. And so there is like a return of cash coming. It's not the family holdco that never does anything and it just drifts. It has. I was actually good.
That's how I was going to wrap this up. I was going to ask you because, once the Sphere is done in 2023, even if the Sphere isn't making a lot of money and it's kind of a bust, they'll have money coming in from every other source. And I was going to ask you, so capital allocation, you feel pretty good that this is going to be hey, they were supposed to do it at MSGS, but they haven't done it partly because of COVID. But you think this is going to be a levered buyback? Hey, we've got these great infrastructure or annuity-like assets that throw off tons of cash and we just buy back those shares, baby.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Anything else you want to talk about before we wrap this up?
No, that's perfect. Thanks for having me.
Chris, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this. MSGE is a cheapstock.com will be the website. I don't think it's up yet, but Chris has said it'll be up in the next couple of days or two, hopefully before this post. I'll include a link in the show notes. I'll include a link to all the kind of quotes and stuff I was talking about in the show notes as well. But Chris McIntyre, thanks for coming on for the second podcast and looking forward to the third one.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me again.